How's it going, guys? Ryan here, and today we are going to be talking about word clocking and what it is and why we use it and how to properly utilize it in our rigs that we have. And so this video kind of piggybacks off of my previous video on sample rate. So if you haven't watched it or you don't really know a lot about sample rate, I highly suggest and would appreciate it if you go back and watch that video, and that'll kind of help clear some things up. They seem kind of fuzzy when I'm talking about sample rate today. But if you're a veteran, you've kind of been around the block and you know what sample rate is, then we can just kind of get right into it today. So, what is word clocking? Now, some of you might be like, oh man, I've been around a long time. I know what it is. I've used it a lot. I know how to properly utilize it in my system. Great. But for those of you who are like, oh, I see the word clock jack on the back, or it says WC in or out or whatever, and I don't know what it is, and it's kind of scary, so I kind of just ignore it and leave it alone and never really use it. For those of you like that, I'm going to kind of give you a quick and dirty explanation of what word clock is, and then we'll get into why it's useful and what we need it to do. So basically, word clock is a signal that helps sync up multiple digital devices that need to do sample-based processing. And so, for example, let's say you have an ADD converter, like on an interface or something like that, and it's set to 44.1K, and so it's taking pictures of the analog data that it's being given 44,100 times every second, and then it's spitting that data out somehow digitally through either USB or ADAT or SPDIF, AES, any kind of protocol it's using. It needs to know, internally it has a clock that tells it how fast to go. So to have a clock that's kind of going at around 44.1, telling it to do its job every time per second. The problem is whenever it needs to be linked up to another digital device that also needs to be running at the same sample rate so that everything can get synced up. And that's where word clock becomes useful. So for example, I have a RME PCIe interface built into my computer, and I also have my converters, which have ADAT out. And so basically my converters convert the signal and they spit it out via ADAT into the RME, and the RME is what puts it into the computer so I can work on it in Pro Tools. And then vice versa, then spits it back, the RME then takes audio playing back out through ADAT into my converters and then spits it back out through my speakers. So basically, with those two digital devices, my converters and my RME need to be synced up so that they're all doing their jobs at the same time so that nothing gets all jumbled up. And so my RME is set to the master, and we'll talk about master-slave relationships in just a minute. But my RME is the master, and it has a clock inside of it, just like my interfaces, that's going at around 44.1 thousand times a second. And what the word clock does is it overrides my interface's internal clocks that are also going at around 44.1 times a second, but not quite the same, because the way it's going to be impossible to make two clocks that are going to go at the exact same rate, like precisely. It's virtually impossible, so nobody really bothers. The way we get around that is that you use one clock to sync everybody, and that clock usually is called the master. And then everybody else is then slaved to that clock, so that basically the one clock overrides everybody else's clock, so everybody's following the same dude. It's kind of like, you have one leader and everybody else follows them. Instead of getting, 10 different orders from 10 different leaders, it gets really confusing. So basically, my RME tells all my interfaces and all that to do their jobs at however fast it clock is going, so that everybody's on the same page, and the ADD converters all take pictures at the exact same moment, and then the RME can make sense of it, because as they're sending data over ADAT into the RME, it knows when exactly it's sending which data, because it splits it up in different timings. And so whenever it sends a pulse from the sample, it knows exactly which sample it's getting back, because it's been time locked. So it's not all a jumbled mess just getting flung at it. It knows how to make sense because everybody's timed to do their job. Kind of like a stoplight, like everybody kind of takes their turn. Whenever everybody says, okay, you have a green light, then you have a green light. So everybody knows who's going. The RME is kind of running the stoplight, so it knows exactly what it's getting per every sample per second. And so there are basically, with that in mind, there are two different kinds of clock sources that a digital system can have. There's internal clock sources, which are the clocks built into, your interface or your processors and things like that. And what they are is just basically their own little clocks that are spinning around at whatever sample rate you set. So if your sample rate is at 44.1, then like say you have your interface set to 44.1, there's a little clock in there that's spinning around that tells everybody to do their job at precisely, 44.1 times a second. And every single interface, anything like that, has to have one in order to know how to take its pictures correctly. External clock sources are any clock that is not inside the specific device. And so to my RME converters, the clock inside of it is an internal clock, and so it knows exactly what that is. To my A to D converters, the RME clock is an external source because it is outside of the unit. Does that make sense? And so my converters have their own clock inside, but I override them with an external clock that is the one inside my RME interface. And so the differences between those two is kind of unfortunate, but basically the internal clock of a unit is always going to be, always is going to be better than the external clock you could feed it. And this is true for almost every single interface out there, save like the really, really early, I'm talking like the very beginning of digital interfaces. Those had some problems trying to design clocks, but after a while we kind of got it nailed down, and it's been solid for years. And so unless you have like a really ancient interface, the clock inside of your interface is always going to be better for that interface than any other external source you could give it. And I know that might sound contradictory to some other things you said, because some people have like external clocks, like, there's the Big Ben and things like that, where people make a lot of money selling these clocks and saying, hey, you hook this up to your interface and it'll make it sound better. And some of it can seem kind of true because, better clocking does make things sound better because it reduces some kind of noise and distortion that can happen if your clock isn't stable. But most clocks are pretty darn stable, as I said, unless you have like a super old interface. So say even if you have like some new version like those Behringer ADA 8000s or things like that, the clocks in those are way solid than anything you're going to give it to it externally, because it doesn't matter how solid the external clock is, the internal clock is always going to be naturally better for the system than an external one would be. Now, the only problem is that for any system that has more than one interface or more than one digital processor kind of unit, some of them are going to have to read from external sources, because you can't have 10 masters all telling themselves what to do, because then they're all not on the same page. You got to have one master and slave everybody else off of it so that everybody's on the same page. So everybody except one is going to have to be rigged to read from an external clock source. And all you can hope for is that the audio doesn't get degraded too much from running off of an external source. And so that's what we have these graphs in front of me, is because some of you might be like, oh man, I have an external clock and I know definitely that it improves my sound. And yes, having an external clock does naturally change the sound, but it's never objectively better, as I'm going to show you with these graphs. Subjectively, you could see the noise and distortion it adds as pleasant, but that would be subjective, because objectively it is adding unintentional noise and distortion. So it technically isn't better, but to each their own. Everybody's gonna have their opinion about, what different clocks sound better and things like that. I'm just gonna show you some graphs and some facts, and hopefully help you guys make, as I say, better decisions in the future. And so here we go. These I pulled these graphs off of a Sound on Sound article they did on this very topic. You can go read that if you want to. But basically, what they did is they tested different converters clocked internally and then externally with some wide range of clocks. I mean, they got some expensive clocks, like multi-$1,000, really nice clocks. And in the end, it still didn't really do much, as you're going to see here. So basically, this first graph I have here is a Behringer unit. And in the purple here is its response when it was given a 1K tone clocked to its internal clock source, the one built into the Behringer unit. And the purple line is the noise and distortion it had whenever it was fed a 1K tone while being clocked to an external clock. And as you can see, the blue lines are definitely noisier than the pink lines. Especially up here when it gets to 10K, you can really see this difference. Like if you can see this right here, like that's a good 10 dB of difference between the old noise floor being clocked internally and the new noise floor being clocked externally. And some of you might be going, oh man, that's just Behringer, it's terrible stuff. And you know, it very well may be true, but then they moved on and they did some apogee stuff. And this is the graphs they came up with. And the red is the unit being synced internally from its own clock. And the blue and purple, which are kind of blended together, but you can kind of see them right here as they pop out. The blue is being synced to a synchrogenius, like an external clock. And then the purple, which is kind of overlaid at the same time, is being synced to a Trinity clock. And as you can see, the internal clock behaves way better than any of the external clocks. You can see, especially right here, right around the 1K tone is where it gets super noisy and super distorted. And so again, with apogee stuff, the internal clock behaved way better than the really expensive external clocks. And if we go down here to this last example, here we have an ISA. And it's kind of hard to see, but the blue line right here, again, is the internal clock set to itself and fed a 1K tone. And then the green and yellow, the yellow is kind of hard to see, but the green especially was when it was clocked to a Trinity 10M clock. And again, that's a good 5 to 10 dB of noise and distortion increase over the internal clock source. And so and these are with nice clocks, like the yellow line was an M clock, I think that's a Drummer. But this Trinity 10M is supposed to be a really nice clock. And you can see even the internal clock did way better, like hands down, way better than either of the external clock sources. And so with those graphs, it's clear to see that, hey, okay, I get it. The internal clocking is way better than external clocking. So, but I have to clock some things externally because I have multiple interfaces. So something's going to have to draw the short straw. So how do I decide that? And basically what people have agreed upon is that whatever your most important A to D converter is, if you can do it, that should be your master. Because usually the A to D conversion is the thing that benefits most from having the clock be the most solid, because it's taking the pictures and you kind of want to get them accurately represented, the music you're sending into it. And so whatever your most important source is on your most important A to D converter, have that be your master. And if you can manage it, slave everything else off of that. And so this kind of brings us to our second thing, is how do we properly slave multiple interfaces and multiple processors off of each other? I have this little graph here, and basically what we have is some master-slave relationships. And so what we have here, as you can see, is the master. This is whatever our most important unit is our main A to D converter, or maybe it's our main D to A converter if we're just doing listening back, or whatever it is, whatever your most important piece of gear is, this is the master. And right here, we have a word clock out from the master. Now, if you can manage it, the most ideal way, say you just have, your master and then you have another slave right here. So ignore these two for right now. What you would do is you just take a single 75 ohm BNC cable from word clock out of the master and go straight into the slave. And that's easy. That's two interfaces, not really that big of a deal. There is some things with termination, and we'll get to that in just a second. But ideally, if this thing has internal termination, all that you need to do is come out of the word clock of the master and into the word clock of the first slave. And even if the master has a word clock in, you don't want to hook any into it. The master doesn't take orders, and so you don't need to have a word clock in. Now, let's say we have 2 slaves. What you need to do is take the word clock out from the master, and then you would have to get this thing called a T-junction, which basically just splits your BNC cable into 2, and you take one part of it, and you go into the word clock in, and then you go into the word clock of the second one. And some of you might be going, oh wait, my slave has a word clock out. And so wouldn't I just go into the word clock in and then out of this into the next one? No, you don't want to do that because word clock outs are only for masters. If you do that, it's going to output the slave's clock, internal clock, into the next one. And then you have 2 clocks working and then it just gets all jumbled up, and that's not what we want. The whole point is to link everything off of one clock, which is the master's. So what you do is you take it out of the master, word clock out, you split it off, and you put 1 into word clock in of slave 1, and then 1 into the word clock in of slave 2. Now, there's another term called word clock termination, and some interfaces have this, some don't. You can look it up because it's kind of important to know this. But all you need to know kind of quick and dirty is that the last unit in your chain, so if we have 2 slaves, the last one, which is number 2 here, has to have its word clock terminated. And what that means is that it has to have 75 ohms resistance across it to properly end the word clock signal. So there's things called reflections that can bounce back up the line this way and could cause the clock to get noisy, and you don't want that. So basically what you have to do is terminate it somehow. Now, some interfaces have internal termination, and if it does, it should have a switch or some kind of jumper you can move to take it on or off. And so if our first slave over here had internal termination, we will want that one to be turned off because otherwise the signal will get messed up coming out of it into the slave 2. And if the slave 2 is our last one in the chain, we want to turn it on because it's the last one so it doesn't get any reflections coming back upstream and messing up the clock. If, however, we have all 3 units hooked up together, this would have to be off because it's not the end of the chain anymore. We have to go down with another T-junction and then go into the word clock 3 in of slave 3. And now you're going, okay, cool. But the only problem is that this slave 3 here doesn't have a switch that says whether it has a word clock termination or not. And you can find it out. Basically, what you can find out, or if you're not sure your interface has internal termination or not, you can just take a multimeter or something and just measure the inside and the outside of the BNC jack on the word clock. And if it has 75 ohms of resistance across it, then it's terminated. And if it has anything drastically different, then it means it's not terminated. And so we say we get to 3, and for some reason, it has something drastically different. So we know that slave 3 is not terminated. So we have to terminate it because it's the last one in the chain. And so what you would do is you put another T-junction here. And then at the end, right here, you would put a 75 ohm resistor. And you can buy them in little things that hook onto the end of your BNC cable that have a 75 ohm resistor built into it. And you just pop that on at the end. And then it kind of acts as like a dummy interface, and it sees 75 ohms of resistance at the end, and it goes, okay, everything's good, the end is terminated, and then you don't get any reflections coming back and forth off this cable because the end is terminated. But you only do this if your last one in the chain doesn't have it, and you got to make sure that nobody else before it has any kind of termination on it, because otherwise it gets all messed up. Now, sometimes this kind of setup is impractical. I call this the linear fashion because you're going from one into another and into another in a line. And sometimes you have like massive setups or there's gear kind of strewn across the entire room, and it's going to be hard to kind of snake a BNC cable all the way around the room, getting with T-junctions and things like that. What you can also do is what is called a star method, which basically what that means is that if your master has multiple word clock outs, or if you buy an external clock and it has multiple outs, you would just take from each out and go into, and say, it also has another word clock out here and another word clock out here. You go out of this word clock into this one, and out of this out into in. So always out to in star formation. And what that does is it allows you to have kind of a more centralized clock and then slave everything to it instead of having to get this really long daisy chain of connections that go from one to another. And also you'd probably need if you're doing any work for audio for video, you would probably need an external clock anyway, because you need to be able to sync your film stuff up to the audio, because it needs to have a certain amount of samples per second played per every frame per second shown. And so that's a whole different thing, and it kind of gets a little messy. So if you're not worrying about that, working with audio, video, don't worry about it. But if you do have a master clock that has multiple outs, you would have one out per every in, and then make sure that each one of those ins is terminated, because as far as slave one is concerned, it's the only thing in the chain, so it needs to be terminated. And then with number two, as far as slave two is concerned, it's the only thing in the chain, so it needs to be terminated, and so on for everything else. So that's all with BNC connections. Some of you might be going, okay, well, my interface can clock with ADAT or over SPDIF or AES and things like that. And that's fine if you're working, if only the clock signal is traveling over that line. So say you're only using the SPDIF connection to connect clocks and no digital data other than the clock source is going over that, that's fine. The problem arises whenever you have digital data also flowing over that channel. So say if you're synced over ADAT, and so the word clock is traveling in one direction over the ADAT, and then all your audio is traveling over the cable as well. Or if with SPDIF or with AES, all those things work the same. What can happen is that the digital audio data can alter your clock in some ways, and usually it isn't a problem, but sometimes it can add some jitter. And so usually, to be safe, it's better to use the BNC connection or a dedicated clock line that doesn't have any digital audio data traveling over it. It's not at the end of the world if you have to do it. Like if you can't afford it or it's the only way you can do it, that's fine. It's just in an ideal world, you'd want to have the word clock signal on its own dedicated line with nothing else on it, so that it can get as clean as possible. All your stuff can be synced up as directly as possible, and everybody's happy. So that's all I had for today. I just hope that this was helpful to you guys in some way. I know this kind of confused me when I first started learning about it, and I wanted to try and help you guys out. If you guys are getting confused about it, I know it can be kind of tricky, but there's a bunch of different opinions online and things trying to say, yeah, you do this. And even some manufacturers in their own manuals have some misconceptions about, like, I knew, was it Apogee, I think, even had on their stuff some misconceptions and stuff like that. So be careful. Again, I'm just a dude that you guys don't know, so don't take my authority on it. I've done my research for people who knew what they're talking about, and it's I'm quoting those guys when I make this video, so you're not really listening to me, you're listening to smarter people. I'm just restating the words in probably a worse fashion because I'm not as eloquent as some of them are. But that's all I had for today. I hope you guys learned something. Let me know, give us a like and subscribe if you did, and be sure to share the video with people who you think could learn how to clock their stuff, or if they need to learn what word clock is, please share it as much as you can. I want to feel like I'm doing something nice with these videos, and that my ego gets stoked whenever I see other people watch it, because then it makes me feel smart and important. So please help me with that. All right, that's all for today. See you guys. Make some awesome music. Make sure your word clocks is all synced up so it all sounds nice and pretty. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.